Hello to everyone, and welcome as we continue our way through this first series of 2021, the first 100 days. Today, presenting a lecture on the State of the Union. On February the 23rd, about a little more than 3 weeks from today, a Tuesday, President Biden will enter the hall of the House of Representatives and present to a joint session of Congress a presentation formerly known as the President's Address to a joint session of Congress. Because he is in the first few weeks, days of his presidency, President Biden is not constitutionally required to deliver a State of the Union address, but if one didn't know any better, of course, what he presents on February the 23rd is going to look, sound, and appear to be exactly like what we now recognize as that annual event, a president, in reality, no longer just advising Congress regarding the State of the Union, but through the magic of television and the internet and all of these various different ways of communicating, the president will have more than an hour, if he chooses, to actually speak to the American people. And in an incoming presidential administration, this gives the president the best time, even more of a concentrated time compared to his inaugural address, to lay out his agenda, lay out his priorities, lay out his hopes and expectations for what he hopes to accomplish in his first year, maybe even alluding to this period of time that we're talking about, these few months, the first 100 days. Now, before we do that, I think it's important to recognize where we've come this far into the year 2021. The year, remember, where everything was going to return to normal and all of the events, all of the horrible events, really, of 2020, the year of the great pandemic, were going to be swept behind us. We've alluded to the fact that in the month of January, we saw on 3 consecutive Wednesdays, the 6th, the 13th, and then the 20th, unusual, unprecedented, scary, happy actions take place, all centered in our nation's capital, mostly centered in the Capitol building, the place where our first branch of government, our legislative branch, our Congress sits and meets. In the future, and probably even as we speak, books are already being written or conceived to talk about again these first 3 Wednesdays in January. We remember, of course, that on January the 6th, when Congress was going to gather in a joint session, presided over by the then Vice President Mike Pence, in order to perform the formality of tabulating, counting electoral votes that had already been certified by the individual states, a violent mob, having previously, for the most part, attended a rally adjacent to the White House, where the president, his son, Rudy Giuliani, his daughter-in-law, even members of Congress, revved up a crowd in gatherings that collectively were known as Stop the Steal gatherings. Basically, we now know, predicated on a number of false, to be generous, yet unproven claims that a vast conspiracy had resulted in the election being stolen from President Trump, who asserted, and probably would still assert today, it was an election he won by a lot. The president at the time having the use, of course, of Twitter, of Facebook, of Instagram, in order to create a vast megaphone, not only to air these grievances, but to communicate with his supporters about the gathering that was going to take place on January the 6th. And we all saw, and maybe to a certain extent are still a little horrified by what happened. A mob storms the Capitol building, calling out for the head, metaphorically, I think, of Mike Pence, of Nancy Pelosi, of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, individuals who somehow were culpable or accessories to the stealing of a second term for President Trump. We watched over several hours as more and more law enforcement made their way into the Capitol, and then eventually the National Guard, in increasing numbers, regained control of the Capitol, rid it of these trespassers, and early on the morning of January the 7th, this joint session of Congress did meet. Mike Pence did preside over it. And when that session had concluded, the results of the election, Joe Biden, 332 electoral votes, 306 electoral votes to 232 for President Trump, was confirmed. In the intervening days, the social media companies that the president had used so adroitly and so cleverly and successfully in propounding his agenda, his messages, began to either suspend or permanently ban the president from using them. So all of a sudden, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and other platforms cut off the president. And to those of us who made part of our daily routine pulling out our phones or looking at our computers to see what was on the president's mind at any particular point of any particular day, you, like myself, might be going through a bit of Twitter withdrawal. He has been significantly muted by these actions. 1 week following this invasion of the Capitol, on January the 13th, the House of Representatives, in a bipartisan vote, 222 Democrats, along with 10 Republicans, impeached President Trump for the second time, really in a little more than a year, in this case returning a single article of impeachment accusing the president of inciting an insurrection against the government of the United States. The 10 Republicans voting along with all of the Democrats to issue that article of impeachment is the most bipartisan impeachment vote the House has ever returned in the 4 total occasions it felt it necessary to impeach an American president. Forget the fact that the president was going to be leaving office in just 1 more week. The remedies to an impeached president are, of course, found in the Senate. The Constitution requires that the Senate conduct a trial with 100 senators acting as a 100-person jury, and only if 2/3, 67 senators, vote to convict an impeached president, the remedy would be, number one, removal from office, but secondly, in a vote that follows, if just by a simple majority vote, the Senate votes to disbar that removed official from holding federal office in the future, that individual, in this circumstance, hypothetically, President Trump, would be preventing from seeking elective office going forward. Specifically, of course, would not be able to run for president again in 2024. We know that the impeachment trial is scheduled to begin on the week of February the 8th. We know, as we saw last year, that the Senate has the ability through internal votes to establish just about every rule as to how this trial is going to be conducted. Earlier this week, the Senate took a vote regarding dismissal of the article of impeachment. A motion made by Kentucky Senator Rand Paul suggested that the impeachment trial of a former president, President Trump, would be unconstitutional because he was no longer in office. That motion failed, 55 senators voting against it, but 45 senators voting with Rand Paul among them to dismiss that article of impeachment. If those 45 have a similar view regarding the president's culpability in this incitement to this crowd to begin an insurrection, the handwriting is probably on the wall that the president is going to be, acquitted of that lone charge. So that is coming up on February the 8th, that trial. We'll talk more about what occurred then in our next lecture. Finally, on the third Wednesday of January, January 20th, before a COVID-limited crowd with more than 20,000 National Guardsmen securing many parts of the nation's capital, Joe Biden took the oath as the 46th President of the United States. He delivered a soaring, realistic, straight, but ultimately optimistic inaugural address. And then, of course, there was the pomp and the circumstance, COVID limited, of a presidential parade, a meeting with still living former presidents, but for President Trump, and then a video celebration by singers and by concerts, and finally a fabulous fireworks display ending this evening, and ending, of course, this chain of Wednesdays in January where all of these events took place. We know, of course, that President Trump broke with long-standing tradition by not inviting Joe Biden as president-elect, nor Jill Biden as First Lady-elect to come to the White House on the day of his inauguration. President Trump did not accompany Joe Biden and did not attend Joe Biden's inauguration. And we know, of course, that on the morning of January the 20th, while he was still president, President Trump flew to Palm Beach Airport, decamped to Mar-a-Lago, where for the last 10 days or so, he's been pretty much incommunicado as, again, this past president of the United States. We know, of course, like most presidents, particularly those leaving office, the president issued a number of pardons, a presidential power, going back to powers that monarchs once possessed. He ultimately pardoned a number of individuals that were incriminated in scandals of various types during the Trump administration: Paul Manafort, Roger Stone, Michael Flynn, and others. We don't know, really and truly, if the president actually pardoned himself or his children or Rudy Giuliani or anyone else. Most constitutional scholars believing that a president could indeed issue these pardons and sort of put him in his pocket or the pockets of those who received them, not publicizing that they had been issued, but these pocket pardons might in fact be revealed as defenses in the event individuals receiving them might be charged with some federal offense in the future. So it appears we've avoided, at least in the short term, the sticky constitutional question of, can a president pardon himself? We're still on some wild constitutional ground regarding, can a president face an impeachment trial even after he's left office? He's no longer president. And how that plays out, of course, is something that we will see in the course of the next few weeks. Now, Joe Biden is, of course, now President of the United States. He's been president for about 10 days. We've watched him act daily in beginning to implement, to execute the agenda, deliver on the campaign promises he made while on the campaign trail. We recognize, like his recent past predecessors, Joe Biden is at this point acting unilaterally, utilizing the power given to the president to issue executive orders to see that the law is faithfully executed, because for all intents and purposes, he is dealing with a Congress, a legislative branch, that in recent presidencies hasn't been able to pass a lot of significant legislation. And we could recite the list of important issues, like a comprehensive immigration policy, like a bipartisan national health care effort, like sensible regulations, perhaps requiring universal background checks before acquiring firearms, something that 80% plus of Americans are in favor of. But all of these issues and more are irresolvable because of the hyperpartisanship that has created two warring camps, two warring tribes in Congress, which seem to reflect this same tribal warring rivalry that exists in much of the United States. Among and between families, among and between neighbors, people take their politics and their political ideologies very seriously to heart. So it's not perhaps surprising that on the ballot in November last year, below that electing President of the United States, were a number of congressional elections. There were all 435 seats in the House that were on the ballot, and there were 35 Senate seats in a number of states that were on the ballot as well. When all of those votes were counted on or after election night, we found that the Republicans had made significant gains in the House of Representatives. Right now, the margin between the Democrats who hold the majority still, Nancy Pelosi is still the House Speaker, Democrats chair all of the important House committees, they hold 222 seats, while Republicans hold 211 seats. 2 seats are vacant, still to be filled, both coming from Louisiana. One member-elect, unfortunately, passed away, died from COVID after he was elected and before he could enter Congress. And a second Louisiana congressman, a Democrat, Cedric Richmond, resigned in order to join the Biden administration. When all is said and done, there are probably going to be about a dozen seats that separate the Democrat majority from the large, significant minority within the Republican Party. We know that before the insurrection of January the 6th, on January 5th, there were 2 runoff Senate elections in the state of Georgia. And defying the odds, certainly defying my expectations, the Democratic candidates for both of those seats defeated the incumbent Republican senators. Raphael Warnock defeating Kelly Loeffler in a special election to occupy one of Georgia's 2 Senate seats. And Joel Ossoff, 33 years old, defeated Republican Senator David Perdue. So when the dust had settled regarding these 2 special elections, the tally of seats in the Senate stood tied, 50 Democrats, 50 Republicans. By today, Democrats now occupy and control the majority of the Senate. Chuck Schumer is now the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell the Senate Minority Leader, all because the Vice President, Kamala Harris, is of course the presiding officer, the President of the Senate, and in the event there were to be any tie votes, 50-50, she would cast the tie-breaking vote, thus giving the Democrats the most slender of all majorities in the United States Senate. So what has always been in recent presidencies a very difficult task, getting things done via legislation, is in all likelihood only going to be more difficult, certainly until the next election, the midterms of 2022, just 22 short months away, when 34 Senate seats will be on the ballot, and again, in theory, every seat in the House. Now, in the House, since its inception, since its creation, majority rules. So we find that recent House speakers have been able to use the whip system, as it's known, to even with narrow majorities, turn out the vote and get legislation passed, even if only on a straight party line basis. And we can expect that in most of President Biden's ambitious legislative priorities, the House, very narrowly in most cases, in all probability, will come through. That's not the sticking point. The sticking point, instead, as it has been for a very long time will be in the United States Senate. The Constitution gave each House of Congress the right to create its own rules to govern its own deliberations. And in the Senate, and only in the Senate, throughout its history, it has been a body that has given each member, in theory, the right to unlimited debate. If you take the floor, you can talk and talk and talk and talk. And at one time in our history, it was conceivable that one senator, utilizing this right of unlimited debate, could by himself filibuster or prevent a vote from being taken on the matter that unlimited debate was being made about. In modern times, the Senate has changed its rules and now requires that in order for the debate of any bill pending before the Senate to be ready for a straight up or down vote, in which only a simple majority vote is needed to pass that bill, prior to that up or down vote, Senate rules require that 60 senators vote to invoke something called cloture, which actually means 60 senators need to vote to end debate on that matter, because if debate is still ongoing, that matter is not ripe for an up or down vote on the merits. Now, unlike Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and other movies that we've seen where senators have stood up and talked, Strom Thurmond once filibustered a civil rights bill for 24 hours before giving up. All that's necessary today in a Senate that is, in average age, the oldest Senate we've ever possessed in our history, all that's needed now is for 41 or more senators to represent that they are not going to vote to end debate. 41 not voting to end debate means all you'd have are 59 that would vote to invoke cloture, not the magic number of 60. So if this number 41 or more unwilling to end debate holds, the bill or the matter in question will not be heard. Now, until about a decade ago, this filibuster rule applied to just about every matter that could be brought before the Senate. For instance, it applied to the consideration of cabinet department officials that require senatorial confirmation according to the Constitution. It applied to ambassadors and ministers representing our country abroad, and the filibuster rule applied to the confirmation of federal judges, district court, the appellate courts, the circuit courts of appeal, and our nation's highest court, the Supreme Court. And in the beginnings of the 2000s, between 2000 and 2012, we saw the minority party in the Senate increasingly using the filibuster to kill presidential nominations to cabinet positions in particular and to seats on the federal judiciary. The party in the majority always threatening to use a really exaggerated description, the nuclear option, to end the filibuster. At any time, a majority of the Senate, by a simple majority vote, could change the Senate rules, and in particular, could change the Senate rules to reduce the number of senators needed to end debate, to invoke this cloture, from 60 to just a simple bare majority, making it possible, hypothetically, for the majority party in the Senate to do lots of things, no longer having to foresee the need to bring members of the other party on board in order to get to that magic number of 60 votes. So, after President Obama was reelected in 2012, and Democrats were the majority party in the Senate, led by Nevadan Harry Reid, Reid and the Senate majority recognized a large number of Obama executive appointees, agency appointees, and judicial nominees who had been filibustered by actions led by the then minority leader, Mitch McConnell, who had at least 41 votes to not permit cloture and thus not permit a vote on that matter to be taken. So Harry Reid triggered the nuclear option. And through a majority vote, the result was that the Senate rules were changed to only require a simple majority, 51 senators, or in a tied Senate, 50 senators plus the vice president, to end debate, after which the nominee in question could be confirmed. This change of the rules applied to all ambassadors and ministers, all cabinet nominees, all agency commissioners, and to all federal judicial nominees except for Supreme Court nominations, where that 60 vote needed for cloture in order to confirm that Supreme Court nominee would still be maintained. Now, in the short term, of course, all of President Obama's hung up nominees were confirmed. However, in 2014, Republicans won the majority in the Senate, and they held it, of course, for 6 years until the last few days when Democrats took control of the majority. And in 2016, of course, Donald Trump, a Republican, became president of the United States, and upon his inauguration, had waiting for him an empty Supreme Court seat. That made open by the death of Antonin Scalia almost a year before, in February of 2016. President Trump nominated Neil Gorsuch, an appellate court judge from the Mountain West Circuit, and hearings were held. And when the time came to debate Gorsuch's nomination, the Democratic minority attempted to filibuster that nomination, to put forward more than 41 senators who were unwilling to end debate, thus depriving Gorsuch of an up or down vote. And this time it was the Republicans who triggered the nuclear option. a vote was taken, and by a simple majority vote, the Senate rules were changed once again to no longer permit the filibustering of any judicial nominee, including those nominated to the Supreme Court. Gorsuch was confirmed, and then, of course, subsequently, we saw Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett confirmed by very narrow margins, less than 60 votes each, to take their seats on the court. So any legislative matter that Joe Biden presents to Congress is still the type of matter that is subject to the filibuster rules, meaning that in a 50-50 Senate, any important legislative matter that, again, probably will pass the House narrowly, maybe just on a party line vote, will have to reach somewhere along the way that 60 vote threshold. Some Republicans will have to vote along with Democrats in order for important legislative matters to be given an up or down vote. So, like President Trump before him, like President Obama, like President George W. Bush, and then less frequently by presidents in the 20th and 19th centuries, this Senate filibuster stands as an impediment to big things legislatively being done if they happen to exist near these very hard political fault lines that we've seen emerge in our own population, and I think is reflected within Congress. Right versus left, conservative versus liberal, big government versus small government. All of these matters, once upon a time, compromised and dealt with through diplomacy and statesmanship, are not easily resolved in these new and different political times in which we live, something that we're going to talk about in our lecture next month. Now, there is one exception to the filibuster rule regarding legislative matters. And that has to do with an arcane process called budget reconciliation. If a matter pending before the Senate is one that is primarily concerned with the expenditure of funds from some government budget, going through the budget reconciliation process means that that matter, dealing again with the appropriation of budgeted funds and the spending of those funds, could be achieved by just a simple majority vote. 50-50, vice president breaking the tie is, of course, the narrowest vote possible. Now, we are probably going to see, or by the time you see this, already have seen, the Senate possibly use budget reconciliation to pass many parts of President Biden's COVID relief bill that calls for, among other things, the expenditure of $1,400 per person in additional stimulus funds, the continuation of federal unemployment supplemental payments beyond the end of March through the end of September, the weekly benefit increasing from $300 to $400 a week. The expenditure of several $100 billion to provide badly needed relief to state and local governments, both red and blue, although of course the largest urban areas in the United States are those where Democrats govern, and some of the states most notably needing aid, states like New York and Michigan and Illinois, are states that have Democratic governors. Unlike the federal government, states are required to balance their budgets annually. So after a year of COVID shutdowns, of business closings, of restaurant closings, the revenue taken in by states and municipalities has declined, and declined in some cases precipitously, meaning that these states might have to consider some draconian cuts in, for instance, the size of their police force, their fire departments, teachers, important public service jobs that will not be able to be continued without an infusion of federal dollars. Last year, Mitch McConnell referred to this as a blue state bailout, which of course sounded good as a soundbite, but we know that there are states and municipalities all over the country, led by members of both parties, that are in these dire straits, and the president wants to render aid to them. And finally, President Biden wants to build a federal infrastructure in order, number one, to ensure that schools have been made as COVID-proof as possible, so that after his first 100 days in office, most schools around the country will be reopened. And in order to do that, the president is attempting, and in fact has begun, to federalize, to take federal control of testing, vaccine production, vaccine distribution, and of course, in some cases, the administration of vaccines to get more shots into people's arms more quickly. His COVID relief bill would also call for an increase of the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. This is a bill that the president has talked about for a long time as a candidate, as president-elect. He talks about it as a bill he hopes to enjoy bipartisan support, meaning that Democrats and some Republicans will vote to support it. But as we stand here today, a little past the fourth Wednesday in January, it's hard to see a lot of bipartisan support manifesting itself for this bill. There are several conservative, moderate Democratic senators, among them West Virginia's Joe Manchin, Montana's John Tester, Senator Kirsten Sinema from Arizona, have expressed a little discomfort with the size and the ambition of this package. So it's possible that by next week, by the first week in February, the week before the impeachment trial of the former president begins, we might see the Senate begin to consider these measures in a budget resolution format. The Senate parliamentarian, the umpire of the Senate rules, has the final say in determining whether or not these types of expenditures are ripe, are legitimate to use through the reconciliation process. Former West Virginia Senator Robert Byrd, a long-serving member of the U.S. Senate, was responsible for crafting many of these rules limiting what matters could be considered via budget reconciliation. The process where the Senate parliamentarian goes through each matter and says, this is appropriate, it can be fast-tracked through reconciliation, or this matter is not, like that $15 minimum wage. That has to go, perhaps she'll say or he'll say, through the regular legislative process, which means 60 votes to make it pass. This process of consideration of these matters by the Senate parliamentarian has come to be known as a, quote, Byrd bath. Robert Byrd, B-Y-R-D, bath, putting it through that set of criteria that highlights these matters. That's it. We're looking, of course, at a president who has big ambitions. He wants to do, again, a comprehensive COVID bill. He wants to do and believes that there is a nucleus of senators who are willing to do comprehensive immigration reform. Not DACA, not building a wall, not an enhanced detection and deportation of individuals in the country illegally, but a bill to solve all of those problems. That bill would require legislation, which means that 60 vote threshold to vote on that bill must be met. We know the president wants to go big on energy policy and wants to put our country on a path more rapidly away from the use of fossil fuels and pollutants, and more in a direction of using clean energy or renewable energy, solar, wind, geothermal, and hopefully stimulate the growth of good-paying jobs by putting the United States in a greater position to build the machinery needed to create solar energy, build our own windmills, rebuild our electric grids to handle and be more nimble dealing with these energies. And of course, all of these matters, all of these great ambitious ideas can only be accomplished through the legislative process. You need 60 votes to end debate to get to a vote. Where do we see a bipartisan coming together in the realm of energy policy? A fourth goal that the president has in mind is something President Trump, President Obama held as goals as well, and that is rebuilding our nation's crumbling infrastructure, roads, highways, bridges, long parts of interstate highway systems, water treatment facilities, antiquated electric grids, all agree need to be updated. Many roads and bridges need to be rebuilt. The question is, how do you pay for it? And if one of the answers, of course, is the T word, taxation, we find again these political fault lines coming into play. Many Republicans still finding themselves bound by pledges they'd made earlier in their career, maybe when first seeking elective office, to never vote to increase taxes. So how do you get the 60 votes needed to permit the rebuilding of our infrastructure at a time when the cost of borrowing money, essentially 0%, will never be lower? Good luck finding a national will to do that. President Biden campaigned on a pledge to roll back, maybe even repeal, a large part of what was President Trump's largest and maybe singular great legislative achievement, and that, of course, were the tax cuts of 2018, greatly reducing the corporate tax rate, somewhat reducing the tax rates for middle-class earners. That bill, the Trump tax cuts, passed in 2018, not going through the regular legislative process. No Democrats signed on to support it. The Trump tax cuts of 2018 passed by going through that budgetary reconciliation process where Republicans, and only Republicans, fewer than 60, but more than 51, voted in favor of them. So we might see the Senate, via that same reconciliation process, attempt to claw back on some of the reductions that were a hallmark of that bill. President Biden has vowed to protect the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. We know that President Trump, as one of his goals, sought to completely overturn or repeal the Affordable Care Act using the reconciliation process, not needing 60 votes, the personal mandate, the requirement that everyone buy and have insurance was repealed. And we know that in the Senate, the Affordable Care Act in its entirety was almost repealed. Most Republicans were going to vote to do so, but quite notably, the late Senator John McCain, as well as Susan Collins and Alaska Senator Lisa Murkowski, would not vote to do so. This, of course, many of the revisions that President Biden hopes to make regarding the Affordable Care Act has to be done through the legislative process. You need to get somewhere along the line 60 senators to agree to have a vote on these matters. Now, we see, notwithstanding this barrier, this filibuster, presidents recently get things done. And they do so by engaging in the signing of less permanent executive orders. Now, what in the world is an executive order? It flows from Article 2 of the Constitution's requirement that the president ensure that the laws are faithfully executed. The president is indeed, among all the various hats he wears, our nation's chief law enforcement official. About 100 years ago, a little more actually, at the turn of the last century, around 1900, 1900, we saw an America that was very much in the midst of great change. We saw through the railroads, the coming of the automobile, through various forms of mass communication, through the United States becoming the world's greatest industrial power, the greatest manufacturer, the greatest exporter, that we were more a union of 50 states, really, than a confederation of states. Meaning that once upon a time, individual state legislatures were able to deal with most of the matters taking place within their borders through legislative actions. Things like commerce tended to be local, but by the beginning of the last century, we would see, of course, commerce in the United States exist from coast to coast, and then very quickly international in scope. So presidents like Theodore Roosevelt, and then Woodrow Wilson, and then after a break in the 1920s, Franklin Roosevelt began to push Congress to utilize its power given to it in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution to regulate interstate commerce. And the means by which Congress, the means by which Congress has done this is by delegating a lot of the enforcement and implementation of acts of Congress to the executive branch, to the now 15 or so cabinet departments, as well as these creatures of congressional invention, executive agencies, more than 100 of them, known by their initials, that have been given the task of implementing and then enforcing, checking to see that acts of Congress in certain subject matter areas are implemented and are being complied with. So the president sits atop the executive branch and sits atop, in totality, millions of individuals who cumulatively make up the federal workforce. Most of them civil service protected career employees, many of them having developed decades of expertise in little narrow areas of policy. You know, the FCC distributing bandwidth for television, then cable television, satellite TV, and now cellular phones and devices of all types. There are a number, of course, of cabinet departments. The four original, State, Treasury, Defense, used to be known as the Department of War until 1947, and the Office of the Attorney General, the Justice Department, supplemented, of course, by Homeland Security, Health and Human Services, HUD, Departments of Commerce, Interior, Labor, Transportation, Energy, Education, and Veterans Affairs, side by side with these agencies that have, again, a more limited subject matter jurisdiction. The Federal Reserve, the FDIC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the FCC, the FAA, the National Labor Relations Board, the FBI, the Federal Elections Commission, Immigration and Naturalization Services, ICE, Immigration and Custom Enforcement. These all exist within the executive branch, ultimately under the control of the president, who again, on a day-to-day basis, implement policy, laws through the legislative process that are directed to these departments and agencies that have what political scientists call quasi-legislative powers. These agencies and departments often take vague, obtuse laws coming from Congress, like tax law, for instance, and these agencies write the rules and regulations to let entities that are going to be affected by those laws understand what they mean and how to comply with them. These agencies and departments frequently have the ability to make allegations against entities for violating those rules and regs, and even to hold hearings and impose penalties, sanctions, against those determined within that department or agency to have violated those rules. Now, it is within this area of our government, agencies and departments implementing and enforcing laws, that executive orders are used. A president cannot, by the signing of an executive order, and we know, of course, that President Trump had some very ornate executive order signing ceremonies. Once upon a time, these were events where acts of Congress were signed into law. More recently, when we think of presidents acting, think about the last 10 days. It has been a president signing an executive order. Executive orders cannot make law, but executive orders can direct those departments and agencies under the control of a new president, a president from a different party, to re-instruct those agencies and departments on how that president wants these laws to be enforced, often prioritizing some matters for enforcement different than his predecessors, while deprioritizing others. Executive orders, because they don't require the action of Congress, are not as difficult to repeal or to change as matters going through the legislative process. Laws which have to be repealed by congressional action. Executive orders can be consequential. Think of DACA. Think of President Trump's Muslim ban. Think of an executive order during a, quote, national emergency to begin to build a wall. Think of the stepped up detention and deportation of individuals illegally in the country. Think of the policy of family separation in order to disincentivize people from Latin America from coming into our country without proper authorization. Let the word go out that if individuals come with minor children, they and their children are going to be separated. They're going to be detained separately. Maybe someone thinking of trying to come here, knowing this would happen, would not do so. In the last 10 days, in the time that President Biden has been in office, he has in fact signed executive orders countermanding the Muslim ban, which had identified 6 or 7 primarily majority Muslim countries and restricted people from those countries into entering the United States. It was created by the signing of a pen through an executive order. It was overturned by the signing of a pen via an executive order. President Trump put DACA recipients on notice. These are individuals who were brought into the country when they were very young by their parents without proper authorization. President Obama had signed an executive order providing deferred action against childhood arrivals. That's what DACA is, deferred action against childhood arrivals. President Trump had given notice that he was going to cancel the DACA program by executive order, President Biden now has resuscitated these DACA protections. He's ordered that construction on the border wall be stopped. 4 years ago, President Trump, by an executive order, authorized the construction of the Keystone XL pipeline. 4 years later, by executive order, President Biden canceled its construction. President Trump had opened up a large part of federal properties, particularly in the Alaska wilderness, for oil exploration and drilling by executive order. President Biden has signed executive orders, once again, more greatly protecting these areas. Executive orders, again, can't make law, but it can tell agencies under the control of the president, within the executive branch, the bureaucracy, or if you're a more sinister-minded individual, the deep state, on what matters in their areas to prioritize and what matters to de-emphasize. Oftentimes when the party of a president changes, significant changes in emphasis and in priorities. We'll hear a lot about the FCC and net neutrality, something that's gone back and forth. The Mexico City Accord, where for a number of presidencies, Republican presidents have signed orders banning American funds going to international agencies that provide abortion information or services to people abroad. When a Democrat comes into office, like President Biden did, he signed an order overturning President Trump's order. So we'll continue next month and in April to talk about the progress of President Biden's legislative agenda and priorities, and point out if any significant matter is dealt with through the way the founders envisioned the legislative process. Will 60 senators come together in matters that require 60 votes to get big things done? When will the Biden administration use the legislative process, but through the shortcut of reconciliation, to just scrape by all 50 Democrats and Vice President Harris passing bills via reconciliation in the Senate? And when executive orders, often seen by presidents as the only alternative they have to begin to deliver on their campaign promises. So, the Constitution requires that the president from time to time give to Congress information regarding the state of the union and recommend to their consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient. That is required by Article 2, Section 3 of the Constitution. President Biden on February the 23rd isn't going to give a State of the Union address literally, given that the focus of State of the Union addresses typically is what's occurred in the last year. But in this address to a joint session of Congress, unless you know this technical difference, semantic difference, it's going to look and sound just like State of the Union addresses of the past. The president will be invited by the Speaker of the House to address again this joint session of Congress. The cabinet will attend. The Supreme Court, or part of the Supreme Court, will be there. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, some of our ambassadors and foreign ministers will be there as well. once upon a time, this function was performed by a president writing a letter to Congress, and that letter being read to both the House and the Senate. From 1801, when Thomas Jefferson thought the idea of going and traveling to speak to Congress smacked too much of some privilege of royalty, some monarchic privilege, to 1913, when Woodrow Wilson traveled to Congress to deliver his State of the Union address. Every president from 1801 to 1913 performed this responsibility via the writing of a letter. In 1981, former President Jimmy Carter wrote a letter to Congress about how the last year of his presidency had played out. Harry Truman had done the same thing on the way out in 1953. President Eisenhower in 1961. Now we see again incoming presidents using this as a time to capture this national audience, because again, the president really is not just speaking to Congress, he's speaking to the American people. All the major networks will preempt a couple of hours a time to show the speech, and since the 1980s, the opposing party will identify someone to deliver a rebuttal to what the president had just said. Kind of a throwback to that old equal time era in which we once lived. Cable news channels will treat this like a Super Bowl of sorts. And we know, of course, that a couple of days before this speech is going to be delivered, the ubiquitous countdown clock will appear on the screen. CNN, Fox, MSNBC. If you're too stupid to figure out how close it is between now and 9 o'clock tonight, look at the screen, and this clock will tell you exactly how far away this speech is. George Washington in 1790 delivered the first State of the Union address, again, to a joint session of Congress. From 1801 to 1913, it was delivered by letter, and then Woodrow Wilson in 1931 resumed the practice. It's generally given in late January or sometime in February since 1934, when the inauguration for a president was moved from March the 4th to January the 20th. These speeches take place now in usually January or February. In 1936, Franklin Roosevelt was the first president to deliver the State of the Union speech at night. And he did so to a joint session of Congress to a nationwide audience through the magic of radio. The only previous time a president had addressed a joint session of Congress at night was in 1917, when Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany, which it did. In 1923, Calvin Coolidge, in a daytime State of the Union address, did so through the magic of radio. 1947, Harry Truman, televised State of the Union address during the day. 1965, Lyndon Johnson established the practice of delivering this State of the Union address at night in prime time to a larger viewing audience. In 1968, the networks gave unlimited time to President Johnson to deliver this address, and then had panels discuss, imagine that, experts, in this case real experts, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Milton Friedman among them dissecting what the president had said earlier. 1997, Bill Clinton's State of the Union address could be watched through the World Wide Web. In 2007, George W. Bush's State of the Union address was the first in which the president thanked Madam Speaker for having invited him to give that speech. This event, February 23rd, will be one, for the first time in our history, where President Biden will look over one shoulder and see Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, and look over the other shoulder and see a woman of South Indian and African American extraction, the Vice President Kamala Harris, the President of the Senate. The night of the speech is, again, one of these great celebratory traditional days, at least it used to be, in our nation's capital. Trust me, it was once considered one of the great drinking events. You know, you imagine members of Congress tailgating in their offices. Lots of them who used to have, pretty good appetites for alcohol, staggering into the chamber to listen to this speech. Imagine instead of metal detectors, if members of Congress had to pass breathalyzer tests before they were let in. It would look like a C-SPAN audience maybe, at least in the old days, virtually empty. The president formally invited. Every member is permitted to invite one guest. The president can invite 24 guests, as the House Speaker as well can invite 24 guests to sit in the gallery and watch this event. At 8:30, the Deputy Sergeant at Arms of the House, if he or she wasn't fired following the invasion on January the 6th, invites senators, Supreme Court justices, the Joint Chiefs, and cabinet officials to take their seats, as well as the Vice President. Customarily, one cabinet member, at least, does not attend the State of the Union address. Since 9/11, that one cabinet member has been kept in a safe, secure location, as have several members of Congress, as have justices on the Supreme Court. These individuals, known by the very upbeat title, designated survivors. In the event some calamity occurs where everyone in the Capitol building is killed or injured, there will still be a rump of a government ready to take up action. Just after 9 p.m., the House Sergeant at Arms, or maybe the acting House Sergeant of Arms, announces, "Madam Speaker, the President of the United States." And then, of course, we see the spectacle, the president slowly walking down the aisle. Individuals who in some cases have camped out to have seats along the aisle shake the president's hands, bump fists, or elbows, I guess, with the president, take pictures, get autographs as the president slowly makes his way to the rostrum. The applause continues. It finally slows, at which time the Speaker will say, "Members of Congress, I have the high privilege and distinct honor of introducing to you the President of the United States." And again, everybody's up on their feet, they're hooting, they're hollering, they're cheering, and then the speech begins. Usually it takes about an hour with lots of applause interspersed for the president to get through the reciting of his accomplishments, his goals, and the new policies he hopes for this Congress to consider. Usually it's positive, usually upbeat. Sometimes you'll find a member acting out of order. Remember about 10 years ago, a congressman from South Carolina yelled, "You lie," at President Obama during the course of some assertion he was making in this speech. In 1982, following the crash, I think, of an Eastern Airlines plane near the 14th Street Bridge in Washington, D.C., President Reagan invited a man by the name of Lenny Skutnik, who had happened to run to the crash site and pull, I think, several of the flight attendants to safety in this fatal crash. Everybody clapped and cheered for Lenny Skutnik, a hero of this event. Last year, you may recall, during the State of the Union address, in a great surprise, President Trump conferred the Presidential Medal of Freedom upon Rush Limbaugh, the First Lady placing the medal around his neck. That was also the speech at the end of which, very prominently, Speaker Pelosi tore up the copy of the speech that the president had given her in advance. He'll give both the vice president and the speaker one as well. There have been some notable moments in State of the Union addresses. I'll run through them very quickly. In 1823, fifth President James Monroe articulated what's come to be known as the Monroe Doctrine in his State of the Union address again of 1823, telling European countries that the Western Hemisphere was closed for future exploration and colonization. Keep the ones you got, but don't think you're going to come into our backyard and establish new colonies. In his 1904 State of the Union message to Congress, Theodore Roosevelt articulated what's come to be known as the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which stated not only what Monroe said, but that the United States would intervene to protect and defend defenseless peoples against brutal actions taken by foreign colonizers, or, in the case of Colombia, against its own citizens, particularly those living in what was then a northern part of Colombia that would soon become Panama, a place through which an American-built canal would soon appear. In January of 1941, war in the Pacific, war in Europe, President Roosevelt, in his State of the Union address, articulated what came to be known famously as, in his mind, four freedoms that everyone living on earth has a right to possess. One, freedom of speech and expression. Two, freedom of worship. Three, freedom from want. Four, freedom from fear. Huge language at that very critical time in world history. In 1964, Lyndon Johnson, in his State of the Union address, 2 months following the assassination of President Kennedy, articulated the programs that would cumulatively be known as the War on Poverty that he actually saw Congress to enact. And in 2002, again, months after the 9/11 attacks, in his State of the Union address, President George W. Bush would declare Iran, Iraq, and North Korea to be, quote, an axis of evil. So we'll watch this speech on the 23rd to see if there's any immortal language that may emerge to become part of our history books. Please watch and listen closely as the words executive order, legislation, or next week or the week of February 1st budget reconciliation come into our lexicon. And then finally, let's see whether or not it is possible to impeach a president who's no longer in office, and how this second impeachment trial in a little more than a year plays out. The Republicans who denounced the president earlier this month seem now to be circling the wagons to protect him. What do you do with Donald Trump? And an old adage, comes to mind. They can't live with him. They can't live without him. So his political future will be very much elucidated upon given the outcome of this political event, this trial before the Senate. So, as always, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you all again next month. Take care.